Well, there you have it. MPs are leaving Ottawa for the summer. Now, some do have an extra spring in their step after getting legislation through Parliament. Others probably just excited to get a break from all that fun in question period. So how will they fare when they meet their constituents on the summer barbecue circuit? Let's bring in our front bench panel to dig into that. Joining us now, former British Columbia Premier Christy Clark. She's now Senior Advisor at Bennett Jones. We also have former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's the CEO of Space Canada, and CTV News political analyst, also the former leader of the NDP, Tom Mulcair. Thank you all for being here, even though Vashi's not here. I'm happy that none of you canceled, even though it's me. So you all heard from both Mark Holland and Jagmeet Singh there. First, we're actually going to talk about some breaking news that Meta will be blocking news on its Canadian sites. I guess, Christy, Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez said he'll continue to have discussions with tech giants. Can he get those horses back in the barn?
I think it's possible. I mean, something similar, different but similar has happened in Australia, and they've sort of found a way through it. This kind of gamesmanship seems to be sadly part of the deal. I am not sure that the government took the right approach. I like Minister Rodriguez, and probably you at CTV, I am quite concerned about how the Canadian media is losing its foothold in, its economic foothold in the country. And this kind of everybody having their own narrative that's separate and facts not being checked on social media is a very, very real problem. And we do need to find ways to support the traditional fact-checking media in the country, but I don't think this is the way to do it. I mean, if they can get the horse back in the barn, I don't think it's going to be one that reflects where we're at now. I think the government's going to have to go a long way to meeting Meta and Google and everybody else's goals in order to kind of make a deal. They're going to have to do some backing up.
Yeah, Brian, do you agree with Christy that essentially this gamesmanship is all part of it, but that it's going to be the government that'll have to put a little water in their wine?
I definitely agree with Christy's preamble. I do think, though, the fact that it's in legislation will make it a bit tough. It hasn't gotten royal assent, of course, but nevertheless, it's not like this was a negotiating tactic on the government side. I mean, I'm sure that they'll be open to hearing some suggestions on how they can find a path forward with the tech giants. But I would think the tech giants are going to have to come pretty darn close to what's been proposed and to essentially what the government and other parliamentarians want to see happen. And look, this is a very important issue for Canadians, but it's one that the globe is facing. And what's interesting here, I don't know the business model, so I'm just assuming, but I would go on a limb to say that it's not in Meta's best interest, Facebook's best interest, to not put Canadian news on their platform, but they're doing it because they want to make it very clear to other countries to not try this. Right? It's really a message, right, I think, to other jurisdictions, and it's less about this is what makes sense for Canada, because I would think, given the profitability and given the money that the revenues they get, that they'd be able to have some type of deal where they help journalists and journalist outlets here in Canada, but they just want to send this message globally. So it's a bit of an issue when you take it from the part that this negotiation isn't just about our country.
So, Tom, do you think that this does land in the same place where it did for Australia?
Something pretty darn close, because it has to. It's one thing for the positioning and puffing out their chest and saying, we're not going to be held to ransom and we're not going to be told by big companies what to do. That's a debate that goes back 50, 60 years. At the time it was the IT&Ts and the GMs of the world that were getting too big for their britches and indeed more powerful and richer than many countries. So now we're seeing these social media giants basically saying, well, we don't care what you do in your legislation, we'll just exclude you and we'll forget about you. But they don't want to for the reasons that my colleagues have just given. So I think that there will have to be a bit of a climb down. One hopes not too much, especially if you're a Liberal, because, again, some of the reaction on the Liberal side has been quite strong and indeed a bit strident. Well, we're not going to be pushed around. But at some point, you've got to realize that, yes, we've got to take care of our traditional media. because the world has become more dangerous because everybody gets to be their own news source. So you do have to have some valid media out there with information that's actually based on something other than somebody's received knowledge from the miasma. And we've got models that do exist. When you look at what's actually being done with Apple News, they seem to have made many deals with some of the largest newspapers, for example. Everybody seems to get something out of that. And it doesn't have to be the type of my way or the highway approach that Meta is taking, for example. So there's going to have to be some compromise. It is in legislation, as Brian correctly says, so it's not something you can do by regulation. You've got to change the law again. And that climb down could cost the Liberals considerably because the pushback from the Conservatives has been very sharp, quite well focused, and there are now even experts who are not unsympathetic to doing something who say, you know what, C-18 really falls short of the mark.
Yeah, I've only got about 90 seconds. I'm going to try and split it between the three of you, but let's talk about that election interference probe that continues and all the parties that continue to negotiate over the terms. Christy, we're hearing that we're in the short strokes. So are you expecting something soon?
I am expecting something soon. I think this has been a dead, stinky fish left on the government's doorstep. They put it there, by the way. And I don't think they want it smelling up the kitchen anymore. So Parliament will fold for a while. They'll have a chance to do it with a little less spotlight. They'll get it done, and they'll do their very, very best to put behind them a really kind of ugly, self-created mess for the most part.
Yeah, and Brian, they want that stinky fish gone because they got barbecues to get to, obviously. But do you think it's taking this long because the government is looking for another way to say independent inquiry without saying independent inquiry?
Yeah, bringing stinky fish to a barbecue doesn't really work well. Yeah, I mean, look, it's clear that when Minister LeBlanc came out to basically say, well, look, it's all on all of you to come back to us on what this is supposed to look like, was essentially the government's way of saying, this isn't as easy as you may think. So please tell us what type of terms of reference this inquiry would have, or this probe would have. And I think they made it very clear they'd be open to an inquiry. And what kind of people, so you won't go and criticize them and sort of basically scare them off from actually doing the work. So look, I think they're going to come to a conclusion. Everybody wants to see this sort of move on. The Conservatives and NDP want to see the probe, and of course the Liberals want to go on the barbecue circuit and talk about other things.
So, Tom, is that where we land? It's going to be an independent inquiry that's not called an independent inquiry?
It has to be an independent inquiry, and it's going to be an inquiry under the Inquiries Act, which is a statute of the Government of Canada. It has to be called by the Governor and Council. In other words, Mr. Trudeau and his cabinet make the final decision. It was never David Johnston's decision to begin with, and it has to be unfettered. It has to be clear that there's a mandate to go wide, to call witnesses, to put them under oath. You have the power to sanction people if they're not providing the documents and the information that's being asked of them. This is a classic for governments. There was a massive inquiry to fraud in the construction industry in Quebec. The government tried to narrow it down as much as possible. The public resisted fiercely. So if Trudeau wants to get this thing off his desk, he's got to call it, and call it honestly with the best people available. Not one person in charge, at least three. That will broaden it. You can have more expertise, and then the public will say, okay, we're going to finally get to the bottom of this.